Hello and welcome to Main Mother Matriarch. My guest today is Alex Mills, Professor of Biology at York University in Toronto and specialist in the topic that we discussed today, which is the biology of sex. So what male and female actually mean across species, what we mean when we talk about intersex. It's not really like a third sex, it's something much more complicated than that. Why mammals tend to be very inattentive fathers and all the ways actually in which humans are real outliers when it comes to our sexual behaviour. A very surprising theory as to why dinosaurs went extinct, how sexual coercion operates in other species, homosexuality in other species, or maybe we should say bisexuality in other species, because strict homosexuality seems to be vanishingly rare, and what testicle size can predict about female sexual behaviour. As ever, the extended version of this episode is available at louiseperry.substack.com, where you can find all the other stuff associated with the podcast, from the MMM chat community to the bonus episodes I do with my husband for founding members and the writing that I put up on Substack as well. And a quick reminder that the young adult edition of The Case Against the Sexual Revolution is available for sale. It's a abridged version intended for a teenage audience. If you know of a teenager who you think could benefit from reading it, then please do consider buying them a copy. Alex, should we start with the real 101? What is the purpose of male and female sex categories? Why have species evolved to have these two categories?
Why have they evolved? Well, the category, better define the categories first.
Yeah.
Although it's not usually people's first stab at it, if you ask them the difference between male and female, it really does come down to gametes. And gametes, are eggs and sperm. So really, a nice, simple, multiple choice question on a test is, what's the difference between male and female? And the right answer is males produce the small gamete, which is sperm, and females produce the large gamete. That's the definition. Mm-hmm. And why that is so is a complicated answer. And it happened presumably like 1 billion years ago. So there's a lot of ideas about it. But the idea is, and we can look at modern day single-celled organisms that reproduce sexually, often have equal gametes. They're called isogametes. So they're neither egg nor sperm, although sometimes they're plus and minus because the surface of them is a little bit different. But in all the multicellular organisms like people and trees and mushrooms and so on, when we have gametes, there's always a big one and there's always a little one. Mm-hmm. And there's usually a big immobile one, the egg, and a small immobile one, the sperm. And that's near universal. And so the big question is, why is that? And it seems to be the most plausible argument is, and it's modeled mathematically at least, and that is that there are two virtues that can be selected for, but they work in opposite directions. And one of the virtues is to be big for survivability, and that's the egg. So, if you're a gamete and you get to choose, which you don't, but if you got to choose, you could say, well, one strategy is I'm going to be a big gamete, I'm going to be a big target, I'm going to invest my gamete, this will be an egg with lots of stuff, and I'm going to survive. The alternative strategy is, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to be small, but I'm going to produce billions of them, and I'm going to be mobile, and I'm not going to be very long-lived, perhaps, but I'm going to have a very high chance of finding one of those big egg gametes. And so the idea is that there's been sort of this disruptive selection in two different extremes. And it seems to be, as I say, a near universal for multicellular organisms. The model we're familiar with is that sperm are mobile because they have these flagella, these little whip-like things, and they move around. Plants don't have that, but plants reproduce sexually, but they do move. The little gamete moves inside pollen grains, so it's also small and mobile. So that's really, the launching point for male-female. It's nothing about who's aggressive and who's nurturing and all those things, although we can sometimes it's a long road, but we can sometimes make connections between behaviors of the organisms that make the gametes and whether they're smaller or large.
Is there such a thing as a third sex?
There is not.
So there are different combinations. So it's thinking of humans, when people are intersex, this is
Right.
often colloquially described as being a third sex.
Right.
My understanding, though, is that it's more like some unusual recombination of male and female, if that's putting it right.
Yeah, well, there's all sorts of issues. I always want to be sensitive about the language, but all sorts of issues that can result in an intersex, we'd say an intersex phenotype. That's the organism that potentially reproduces. So intersex individuals, if we're thinking of humans now, but we can have intersex in other organisms as well, there's usually there's something that hasn't gone according to the normal plan. And you can end up with maybe, we haven't mentioned gonads, but, if we go back to egg and sperm, and we're thinking of animals, of course, sperm are made in testicles, and eggs are made in ovaries. Sometimes when we have an intersex individual, there are rudimentary testes, but maybe they haven't descended, so they're still inside the body. Sometimes there are ovaries, but they've been loaded with testosterone and they don't function as ovaries. And then if we think about the external genitalia, which is usually, if a baby is born and you're curious what sex it's going to be, and you look, you can have ambiguous genitalia. But it's not as if, if we go back to gametes, which are the two things that join in sexual reproduction, there's no kind of intermediate gamete. There's not any phenotype that makes sort of a half mobile, mid-sized gamete. Almost always intersex individuals are infertile. And there are a lot of many things. We could consider some examples. It might be kind of technical, but there is some genetic cause that leads to that intersex condition. Sometimes it's some mutated gene, something that affects the hormonal balance in the developing fetus. There's a number of things.
So people can end up looking phenotypically ambiguous, but in terms of the genetic building blocks, it's only X's and Y's that we're dealing with. It might just be...
Yes, that's right.
It might be genetic or it might be a developmental issue.
Yeah, and usually, though, if it's developmental, you see, like in humans, we're sort of neither male nor female for about 6 weeks after conception. And you reach the 6th, so that's like halfway through the first trimester.
You mean it, but not genetically. I mean, when babies are conceived.
Well, you're right. When they're conceived, the baby either is XX or XY. But there's no consequence of that for about 6 weeks.
Right.
And then at about 6 weeks, there are the rudimentary gonads. They're neither testes nor ovaries. But because of a gene on the Y chromosome, or the lack of it, then those bipotential, they can go two ways. Those gonads start to become testes or ovaries. And so that really starts at about 6 weeks, quite early in pregnancy in humans. And then there's a cascade of changes, so that by the end of 9 months, you have, in most cases, a typical boy or a typical girl.
So I suppose in addition to those, when development goes awry in utero, there are rare conditions like Klinefelters, right, where there's something going on genetically.
Yeah, Klinefelters actually happens before conception. So a person who has Klinefelters has 3 sex chromosomes, which is unusual. It's not that rare. I don't know if it's like 1 in 2,000 or 1 in 1,500 males or something. So, and so that individual has 2 X's and a Y, 47 chromosomes instead of 46. And so then you say, well, that would seem to be someone who is in between. But actually, people with Klinefelters are very phenotypically male. And it really goes to show, there is other evidence as well, it really goes to show it's the presence of the Y, not the dosage of the X, that determines maleness. So if you're an XXY, you're a male, but you have Klinefelters and you might have some associated developmental difficulties.
Is Klinefelters the condition where it's overrepresented among male prisoners?
Apparently,
yeah.
I've heard that. I don't know how strong in support that is. It's probably also safe to say that most Klinefelters don't have criminal behavior.
Sure, but maybe it's to do with I don't know, we're speculating, but maybe it's to do with higher testosterone levels or something like that.
It might be more to do with learning disability,
Oh,
which is,
yeah, okay.
there are
Yeah.
with people who have an unusual number of chromosomes often have some cognitive challenges, and that could also, get a person in trouble with the law.
So moving away from humans, it's quite common for, well, sticking partially with humans, it's quite common for people to, progressives, to point to other species which have quite different ways of managing reproduction and use this as evidence for the male female binary not being as straightforward as you might think. So,
Yeah,
seahorses are a classic example.
sure. Seahorses are a great example of something that's unusual. I mean, they're very exceptional organisms. Seahorses, pipefish. And, probably most listeners know, but if they don't, seahorses have an unusual sort of sex role reversed. I'm putting sex role there in quotes.
Mm-hmm.
The males have a pouch. The males produce sperm, though. They produce the small mobile gamete. But in this unusual situation, the female delivers her eggs to the male. She has an ovipositor, so it's kind of like the male penis or intromittent organ, but she delivers eggs into the pouch. His sperm fertilizes them inside his pouch, and he nurtures them there, I think, for about 3 weeks or so. It's certainly a minority of cases, but there are a number of cases we could cite where males do more of the parental care. And that's an
Mm-hmm.
exceptional one because the fertilization actually happens in the male. How would you, if I'm only asking this rhetorically, how do you use that to uh, indicate, therefore, that there isn't male or female? There's still male and female. There's still a very common theme. There's a disparity in reproductive investment. In this rather rare case, the male's doing more of the investment than the female. But it still abides by what's everything I've said so far. There's a male and female binary. Certainly, if you want to say, it doesn't have to be the female that's the nurturing one or the one that does most of the investment, that's absolutely fine. There's lots of cases in biology.
Mm-hmm.
But when people go to biology, I know you know this, and people know this instinctively. We're not going to go to biology to sort of get a moral code.
Mm.
It's a very dangerous thing to do. In fact, if we really honestly look at biology, it's a frightening kind of place. There's all sorts of, we might think of it as being beautiful. You think of a butterfly as beautiful or whatever, but there's parasites and there's wanton waste and there's coercive sex and there's disease. And if we're going to come up with a moral code or what's right or guidance for people, I think we should know about our biology. Very important to know about it, know what we're up against, but we're not going to get that kind of guidance from looking at nature.
It's quite common in children's fiction. I don't know if you've come across some of these books. We have one downstairs, which was a gift, which is about kiwi birds, which apparently, according to this book, it's the fathers who warm the eggs in the nest. And so we have a book which fairly transparently represents kiwis as kind of really committed stay-at-home dads. I guess it's the union of two favourite things in children's fiction. One is animals, and the other is progressive morality tales.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's great to model fathers, male parenting, and effective parenting is great. But if you were a children's author and you were going to say, "Oh, I'm going to write a whole bunch of books using mammals," you're going to have a very, very tough job to write that kind of book for children. In mammals, like 95% of mammal species, the males don't do any parenting whatsoever. So we're very unusual mammals.
Interesting.
Yeah, and even in primates, the majority of primates, it's females only. So it's quite interesting. We often think of mammals as being sort of the pinnacle, I guess because we're there and it's relatively recent group. But the sort of disparity in male-female investment in mammals is very acute, very dramatic.
What tends to predict greater paternal investment in species? What factors lead to that?
Maybe the greatest factor is, well, we could go back to egg and sperm. Now, I know like a human egg is still very tiny, but a human egg is still about 10 million times the size of a human sperm. So, and that's more extreme in some other species. One thing that predicts female investment is internal fertilization. So that's birds, that's mammals, some reptiles, all reptiles, some fish. So if you have internal fertilization, and I know I'm mindful of the seahorse example, which was sort of opposite, but in 99% of the cases, the internal fertilization happens inside females. Females then have a challenge. Here they are. They have to participate in this reproductive endeavor. They're mating with an individual who produces sperm, gets to theoretically provide sperm and then move off. And then the female is saddled with it. In birds and most reptiles, that's a big egg. But of course, in mammals, it's gestation, which is in humans 9 months, but it's always a substantial period. And then lactation, the nursing period, can be very long. Those are significant costs. But another big cost for the female is she's committed. So a male and a mammal, well, he might invest a day or two worth of sperm and 10 or 15 minutes worth of his time, and he's done. And that may be his success. That might get his genes into the next generation. A female, I mean, this is the sort of the fundamental difference between what males and females are up against. And I haven't. There's some limitations to the male side too, but the female, of course, has all those big costs. The other cost, though, is an opportunity cost. If the female's committed, she's pregnant. She can't get more pregnant. She can't get less pregnant. Then she has the offspring. Those costs during that time, she doesn't have any other mating opportunities. Mm-hmm. So usually when we say and find evidence that females are much more discriminating or choosy, it's not the least bit surprising. A male can make a stupid decision. It's not very costly. A female makes a stupid decision, can be terribly costly.
Do we see greater pickiness among females in species where the maternal commitment is greater because of particularly long gestation, for instance, or particularly dangerous birth?
Yes, I don't know about dangerous birth, but we do see it's very predictable that parental investment relates to choosiness. Mm-hmm. Lower parental investment, usually males, means they're less discriminating. And, the payoff is there. The greater the parental investment, the more choosy. Now, sometimes males, there are offsets. I mean, part of the sparring between males and females is that there are offsets. Female is saying, okay, I've taken all this on. What are you going to do? And if males then get to be chosen by females because they, relieve some of her burden by providing food, territory, safety, all those things that are not maybe the main story, but all sorts of accessory benefits, then that evens the investment out. And then when males are making a big investment, their choosiness increases.
Is human investment in children, both maternal and paternal, unusually high compared with other species?
Well, certainly for mammals, for sure. Yeah. It is unusually high in mammals, as I've said, because, if you can think of mammals at random, almost certainly you're thinking of a mammal where the male doesn't help. In some carnivores, some social animals, males help, like wolves, coyotes, jackals. They help some of the primates, some of the rodents, but most things, bats, most rodents, most cats, bears, they mate and the male's gone.
How about the female investment? Because, so obviously mammals definitionally nurse, but not necessarily for very long. Are there also female mammals that will basically bugger off pretty quickly once their children are a certain age?
Female mammals, that's a good question. I can think of birds. Yeah, so if in mammals we say the norm is uniparental, one parent, but as far as I know, it's always the female. Some listener will be thinking of some exception, but that'll be the nature of it. If it exists, It's very rare. In birds, though, there are more switcheroos. Birds tend to have more. In a way, humans are more like birds. A lot of birds are socially monogamous, like humans tend to be, not perfectly, of course, but females often do the greater share, but males do a significant share. And sometimes males do more. You mentioned kiwis. That's an example. Ostriches also do. There are some other groups of birds. Again, it's a minority where the males are doing most of the parental care in birds, but it does happen.
Is there a relationship between monogamy and father's investment in children? I guess there sort of has to be, because they wouldn't have enough time otherwise.
Yes, that's really a definition of monogamy, although it doesn't mean that the investment is equal. But usually with monogamy, we do mean if it's true monogamy, genetic monogamy, sexual monogamy, we have, really there's no adultery, infidelity, cheating, whatever we're going to call it. Alas, in biology, that's pretty rare among species. We find a lot of, we call it extra pair mating, outside the pair bond mating. But, when there is, we're much more likely to find biparental care in monogamous systems. And if you have something that's polygynous, or I think, as you say in Britain, polygynous, if you have a species there where there's one male and, say, several females, the male sometimes helps, so there can be parental care, but of course it gets watered down the more female partners there are.
So thinking again about monogamy and polygyny, I mean, I guess there is polyandry in nature as well. It's rare in humans, but I guess there must be species that...
Sure, there are. There's really kind of 5 mating systems. One is monogamy. And these don't work that well sometimes, and I'll explain why. But one is monogamy. One is polygyny. One male, multiple females. One is polyandry. One female, multiple males. We can find quite a few cases of polyandry, but it's less common than polygyny, just as it is among humans. Then there's polygynandry, and that's a mating group like chimps or lions, where there's at least 2 of each sex. Usually there's still more females than males, and that's proving maybe to be more common than we realized. Sometimes a little bit cryptic, but a polygynandrous, poly, multiple, gynous, female, andro is male. So that's the 4th one. And then the 5th one, which may also be kind of an overlay, is promiscuity, where there's no bonds, but it can be like polygyny or polyandry or polygynandry. So usually with the first 4, monogamy, polygyny, polyandry, and polygynandry, there is some kind of, maybe not permanence, but it's not merely transitory. But with promiscuity, it really is a mating event for sperm to meet egg, and that's it.
What sort of things predict which species will choose which mating strategy? I've read, for instance, that greater sexual dimorphism is associated with polygyny. Is that right?
That is correct, but it's more likely that polygyny generates the dimorphism than the other way around.
Interesting. Why would that be?
Well, when you look at, what's going on in, I'm probably going to keep saying polygyny because that's the way my brain is trained. When you consider what's happening in polygyny, if you assume there's like 50% males and females, you have, and this happens with the relative ease with which males can increase their reproductive success by multiple mating. So if we ignore some other considerations, a male is going to do better being polygynous if he can get away with it. He's going to get more offspring. And how is he going to do that when there's, say, 50 females and 49 other males? It's going to be very competitive. And a theme of male life in polygynous systems is strong competition. And then when there's strong competition, there are many ways males compete. And one of them is by body size. So often we find that when we have a polygynous system, males have weaponry, which they use fighting each other to have access to females. But we also find that body size has its reward as kind of an adjunct to that. But there's other ways of competing too. Sometimes males have to race to females, sort of a scramble. And then the very interesting one that sounds kind of bizarre, but there's so much evidence for, is males compete actually inside the female reproductive tract, which is sperm competition. So I know that's getting away from your question about dimorphism and predictors, but I guess there's two other things that I might mention that predict whether a male might be successful, or where we might have a species where polygyny is common. Mm-hmm. And that is, can a male control resources? So we often see that's a theme of polygyny. If a male can control something females need, that's going to be a way for him to get access to more females. So with birds, sometimes this happens if the birds nest in nest holes. There's some birds that are mandatory cavity nesters. They nest in tree holes or in birdhouses or something. If males can commandeer those, then they have an opportunity to be polygynous because the females need them. If males can commandeer some rich food supply and females need that food, then they can be polygynous. In elephant seals, you mentioned dimorphism, extreme dimorphism there. If a male can control a birthing beach, then he's going to get access to more females. So we call that resource defense polygyny. So that's one way. The second way is if, for maybe other reasons, females are clustered, then males sometimes can take advantage of that. And we call that female defense polygyny. They're actually defending the females from other males. And so those are two main predictors. If either of those cases is possible, then and you might, I don't know if you're thinking of humans, and I know we're sort of trying to do a survey of animals, but if you think of humans, you can imagine both those. In cases where there is polygyny in humans, you can imagine either of those operating. Humans are social, so females are likely to be reasonably clustered, wherever you can make a living, being in a social group. But also humans are expert at controlling resources. And we know resources does impact female thinking. And so it should. If you're going to be burdened with a baby and all that entails, you don't want to be without resources. Now that can happen in monogamy too, but we aren't surprised to know that we see polygyny in humans associated with a great disparity in resources among males and the rich males. Not the handsome males, not the charming males, it's the rich males that do that. So that's a human version of resource defense polygyny.
So you've raised the issue of sexual coercion in other species, which I want to get to. But first, it's quite a basic question, but because we've talked about ratios between males and females, I assume that there are species where there's quite a significant sex imbalance because of disproportionate death in either sex. Mm-hmm. It's, for instance, through male competition, males battling for access to females. Are there species where there's an imbalance in conception?
Well, I think maybe humans do. Like there's 105 boys to 100 girls, something like that. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't know. I don't know if that happens at conception or if that happens early in a pregnancy. Mm-hmm. Some species, I hope I don't go down too much of a rabbit hole here, but a lot of species have a kind of a genetic sex determination as we do. Mm-hmm. So you can picture, when males make sperm, we'll think of mammals, males make sperm, half a male's sex chromosomes are X's and half are Y's. And those get invested in the sperm the male makes. So human males make like 1,000 sperm a second. And in 500 of those is an X, and in 500 of those is a Y, basically. Mm-hmm. And so then if those sperm have an equal chance of fertilizing the egg, that's how we get a 50-50 sex ratio. Mm-hmm. In some species, some species don't have a genetic sex determination. So they have other sex determination systems, which are, it's almost surprising they work because we're used to thinking of this kind of 50-50 situation. So some reptiles, for instance, have temperature sex determination. So a lot of turtles have this. They don't have chromosomal sex determination. It's the incubation temperature of the eggs. And how that works is some enzymes work better at cooler temperatures or at warmer temperatures, and that affects sex hormones in the developing turtle inside the egg. And so, and it can vary with the species, but, cooler temperatures produce male turtles, warmer temperatures produce female turtles. Now, you think that could get way out of whack.
Yeah.
It seems to work. Alligators are like that as well, and crocodiles. And some lizards are like that as well, where there's this kind of a pivotal temperature where it may be 50-50, but that's very narrow. On this side, it's males. On that side, it's females.
Climate change must be a real problem for those species. I didn't just mean anthropogenic, but in the past, because climate has always changed.
Yes. In fact, and I don't think it's borne out, but people have said, well, maybe that's really why dinosaurs went extinct.
Really?
Maybe dinosaurs had temperature sex determination.
That's so interesting.
And, maybe they survived the great asteroid impact, but when it became too cold, all they could produce is males or something. That's really speculative, but you're sharp to connect it to climate change. And it is a concern some people have about climate change, that you could expect some of these populations to, if they don't adjust quickly enough, to have that happen. Yeah. There's some other ones. There's some marine invertebrates where the larva starts out as neither male nor female. If it's touched by the tongue of an adult female, which carries a hormone, then it turns into a male. If it's not touched by the tongue of a resident female, it then develops into a female. So, that's an environmental sex determination where some hormone from some other individual determines what it is. I'm going to mention something else you mentioned about climate change. There are some live-bearing lizards which can adjust their sex ratio because they're incubating their eggs in their body. They can adjust their own temperature by moving around and producing more males or more females. Mm-hmm. And at least some research from Australia indicates that females do that and they produce the rarer sex. Whatever seems to be rarer in the environment, they'll adjust the offspring ratio in favor of that rarer sex. That's called sex allocation, where females, there's some evidence that mammals can do a bit of this too, where females can adjust the sex ratio of the offspring.
I guess sex ratios within species are going to have a potentially very important impact on mating systems. So if you have an excess of females, for instance, you're more likely to have a polygamous system.
If you have an excess of females, though, maybe, but you might then have less male competition. It makes me think of some situations where there's been some experimentation on polygyny. Like, it makes me think of a couple of things. One is there's something called Fischer's principle, which is that species end up investing equally in males and females, in sons and daughters. And the idea is that it would be logical, in many, many cases, it would be logical to invest more in daughters. Daughters really are more productive. Males, the excess of males on Earth is useless unless it's a mating system that requires fathers. Mm-hmm. But, in most mammals, for instance, you don't need nearly as many males because they don't do anything other than impregnate females. But the idea is that, why then don't we have 5% males and 95% females? And the idea is that, well, a female then is going to invest more in a son because the sons are, if they're relatively rare, they're going to be more successful. And so that will always bring it back to a ratio of 50-50. It's really a mathematical argument. So we do see the 50-50 ratio as, not perfect, but it's very, very common in nature because it makes sense overall to invest equally in males and females. As soon as it gets out of that balance, it's more logical to invest in the rare one, and it brings it back into the mid-range.
So we've mentioned excess males, which is a nice segue to the coercion question. So it was quite common during the second wave to claim that humans are the only species that rape. Yeah, I see you laughing bitterly. This isn't true, right? It's very common in nature.
It's so profoundly untrue. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I guess it's something, people often want to believe what they want to believe, but there's lots of cases where sometimes, depending on the species, it's difficult for males to actually coerce mating, but it's very easy to harass. And there's really a kind of polyandry that has the clean name of convenience polyandry. And that's where it's convenient for the female to give in to male harassment because it's actually the least costly thing. She's not going to get killed or exhausted or whatever. That's convenience polyandry. It's fairly common. Mm. You could go to a nearby park and watch ducks in the breeding season, and you'll see probably coercive behavior, like mallard ducks, not uncommon at all, especially for a gang of them. So it's even where they're fighting with each other and they're coercing mating. So, that's one of those things. If it's worth going to nature and understanding it and saying, okay, here's something that's really common in biology. It's almost always males coercing females, and we don't want that situation in humans. But, so it's once again, we need to always be thinking what our code is, but we might be up against, males harass females more in humans. We know that. It's not 100% of the time that's the way it goes, but it's certainly the majority of the time. And some species do coerce actual copulations, for sure, ducks included.
I know. I wish I didn't know about how rapey ducks are, because I take my kids to the park to feed the ducks, and they're charmed by the little ducklings.
Right.
Think,
That's a sexual conflict for sure. What the male wants and what the female wants, completely out of alignment. The females in ducks, there's this battle. We could talk about a lot of different species, but we're talking about ducks. Females seem to have a fair bit of control whether or not they use those sperm. So mammals don't really store sperm, but a lot of organisms do for long periods of time sometimes. Birds can, and insects can, and reptiles can. And that means they have a complicated reproductive tract. And there's a lot of things that have sort of side pockets and places to store sperm, places where the sperm are asleep until, I don't mean literally asleep, but sort of latent until the female's ready for them. Mm-hmm. And some research on ducks indicates that a relatively small number of fertilizations are from those coerced matings. There's not even a great payoff for males, but maybe for some males, it's the best they can do.
So female ducks who've been raped, it seems kind of weird to use that term about animals, but for simplicity, so female ducks who've been raped can resist that sperm through some mechanism.
Yeah, it's called cryptic female choice. Uh-huh. And, it's a big area of research, but it's difficult. It's easier to study males. Males often have more obvious behaviors, but, what goes on inside the female reproductive tract is more difficult to study. Consequently, sometimes we use insect systems in order to study those things. But yes, chickens will mate with, I should say hens perhaps, will mate with multiple males. Sometimes will be coerced by males, but then they can eject sperm. Most of the work is done on insects. And if I say that and people say, oh, well, insects are so far from humans, that's not going to be very instructive. I think it really is instructive because for some things we wouldn't go to insects to get insights into humans. But really, if we're talking about maybe a polygynous system where males are harassing females, and what we're really interested in is what's going on when the sperm get in the female reproductive tract, it's actually quite interesting. It is an antagonistic battleground. We're used to thinking of male and female as being kind of, ideally anyway, a perfect match, but often the optima aren't aligned, and then we have this conflict.
Why do we see more male harassment of females in some species than others? What predicts that?
Probably the easiest way is to start again with reproductive investment. Females, I will generalize. Sometimes males do more reproductive investment. Mostly it's females. So what does that mean? It usually means females, if they have a time budget or an energy budget, they're investing some maybe in mating effort, but more in the actual reproduction. They're investing in offspring. They're looking after offspring. If it's an extreme case where males are just supplying sperm, then most of their time budget and their energy budget is mating effort. Mm-hmm. And that means then we have this asymmetry, and males then have a higher reproductive rate. They're going to be more competitive with one another because females are less ready, less available because they're doing a lot of the work of reproduction. And then we have this situation where males are going to be harassing females more. And females are going to be resisting. And again, that's because it makes more sense for females to be choosy, to be discriminating, because the cost for a female to be undiscriminating is much greater than the cost for a male. It's nestled in the idea of parental investment again, and on the other side, mating investment. Males are much more likely to harass females. When we do have a polyandrous situation, though, those are beautiful things to study because then we see all sorts of attributes flipped around. So, for instance, some birds are polyandrous. Not very many, but some. And those are usually bigger. So the sexual dimorphism is in favor of female size. Females are usually more brightly colored. Females hold the territories. Females are more aggressive. If anyone's going to commit infanticide, which we'd call ovicide, which is egg murder, it's going to be the female. I mean, usually all those things are attributes of males. But when we have sex role reversal and males are doing most of the work, all those maybe unattractive traits we associate with males show up in females. So it seems very nicely linked in with reproductive investment. In those rather rare cases where males are doing more of it, they get all the check marks for the good things, and the females are the bad guys, competing, fighting, killing eggs, so on.
It's hard not to apply this to, we said at the beginning that you mustn't extract kind of crude morality tales from biology and apply them to human beings, but it's hard to look at this and not conclude that at least a goodish portion of what we see in masculine and feminine behaviour comes down to biology. And this would explain why it's a consistent cross-cultural finding as well, something like male sexual harassment of women, not the other way around.
Yeah. Yeah. Another one, though, and I know you're big on monogamy, and I'm a monogamist myself, so I am as well. But we have to acknowledge that there's very little pure monogamy. And I know we said that sort of at the outset. And, at one time people thought, well, females are inclined to be monogamous and males aren't. But there is a lot of evidence that females are, in a much more discriminating way, non-monogamous, and there's all sorts of reasons why they might be. You might say, in fact, really the model does say, we expect females to be monogamous because they have finite reproductive systems. What's the good of a pregnant female having more partners? A male can keep mating with more and more partners and he can have more and more offspring, but a female doesn't. That's sort of the model. But then when you actually test it, you find that females often are non-monogamous. And it could be, there's a bunch of ideas. One is to ensure against infertility. One is to have more diverse offspring. Often when female birds cheat, they're hypergamous. That term, we associate that with humans, that females like to, it's not universal by any means, but female humans like to mate up in the social scale or in the resource scale. Males are more indifferent. If chickadees, which it's a North American version of the titmice that you have in Britain, if a female chickadee cheats, which they often do, they sneak off and mate with a neighbor, but it's always a higher status neighbor. So they're discriminating again. That may be to get better genes. Another reason females behave non-monogamously is that, some males and females aren't always compatible. Sometimes with human couples where they have trouble getting pregnant, it's not a problem with her or with him. It's a problem with them. So sometimes there's that incompatibility. That happens in nature as well. And so a female may choose another partner for that reason. And sometimes females also will have multiple mates if they can confuse her mates as to who's the father, can then get more parental support from more than one male. And that's clearly happens in some species. And then topping up, sperm, at least in mammals, not so much in maybe some other organisms, but sperm have a finite life. So there's all those ideas. It doesn't mean, of course, when, again, if you go to nature, that therefore, I say this to my classes, it doesn't mean I'm telling you should be not monogamous. But there are, often females that are not monogamous for one or more of those reasons actually have more reproductive success. And it could be any combination of those things. And that's maybe why it's so widespread. That's why we see it. But almost always, those females that are not monogamous are being, again, discriminating. If males are not monogamous, they're being more wanton. Because it's not so costly for them.
Do you see more female promiscuity in species where the fathers invest less and there's therefore less mate guarding? Might be worth explaining what that is to anyone.
Yeah, mate guarding. Well, I might have to get you to repeat the question, but
so I said it in a weird way.
No,
What I'm wondering is that in species like humans, where the fathers invest a lot in their children, the fathers have more of an incentive to mate guard, and therefore are women less likely to cheat because the cost to them in, for instance, violence are too high.
Right. So mate guarding is also a common theme, and it stems from another male-female difference that we haven't really talked about so much, at least when there's internal fertilization. And that is, a female always knows it's her egg, always knows it's her baby. But there's this male problem, which is paternity uncertainty. And really, it's what I was referring to a moment ago. Females in some species exploit that. If they mate with multiple males, that may weaken their commitment, but it may also encourage males to commit to parenting if they think there's a good chance they have the offspring. But mate guarding takes a number of different forms, and it's when males have mated with a female and they don't want her to mate with another male. And this can take the form of a very close following of females. You can see songbirds doing this in the mating season. It can take the form of riding, which is like prolonged copulation, far longer than it needs to be. But if the male stays there, it prevents her from mating with someone else. It can take the form of providing nuptial gifts. That's often in insects, but that prolongs copulation, sometimes days. By providing a gift, the female is eating the gift, and that makes it last longer. So, the extent to which males can successfully mate guard is a predictor of the extent to which they will provide parental care. But you can still have mate guarding where there's not going to be parental care or paternal care. You can still have mate guarding where the male's interest still is having his sperm fertilize the eggs. He's still not going to do anything, but he doesn't want her to mate with someone else. So that's not that uncommon. In fact, in most of those insects, there's no male care, and they're still doing a lot of mate guarding.
Thinking about humans, one way of reading patriarchal systems of control of females, not permitting females to be alone with men that they're not related to and so on, these systems tend to be enforced by all men in a society. And in a way, it's like a pact, right? It's like, we'll collectively mate guard our women because one man can't realistically follow his wife around all day. And the social system kind of performs that function.
I hadn't thought of that. I see what you mean. And then, so if my mind goes to the animal world, I don't think I can think of any parallel where there's sort of a pact among males.
It kind of requires language, doesn't it?
It certainly requires society, and that limits there's social animals, but it limits that for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, you get those powerful males who have, harems. In some historical cases, some monumental numbers of females, and then they have eunuchs to protect the harems from other males, and it's quite a remarkable system. At least biologically, it's the risk of cuckoldry.
Yeah.
That is, males are going to be investing in females, but it's not going to be their children.
The episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.